You're listening to the Grace Plus Zero podcast, exploring the crossroads of culture, faith, and family from a biblical worldview. And now your host.
The Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. It outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Well, now there's a strong push to add sexual orientation and gender identity to the list. On today's episode of Grace Plus Zero, we're going to look at the controversial Equality Act and discuss how it could be used to violate your religious liberty. Hello and welcome to Grace Plus Zero. I'm your host, Brian Moore. And as I said before, today we'll be talking about the Equality Act. And we also, of course, have History Matters and some news, and we have some parting shots for you as well in today's program. Well, first of all, we're going to get straight into it, and we're going to talk about the Equality Act and what you need to know and understand about the Equality Act. If you've been watching television lately or in the last probably month or so, you've probably seen quite a bit of a discussion about the Equality Act. The Equality Act basically is a bill that was proposed by the House Majority Leader, Nancy Pelosi, which would grant gender identity and sexual orientation to the protected classes that are currently under the federal civil rights law. Now, if you remember, the civil rights law was passed in 1964, and with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, certain groups were protected from being discriminated against, and those protections are put in place to protect people, based on race, color, religion, sex. It prevented them from being discriminated against not only in the workplace, but also in regards to things like government programs and how money is distributed, federal funds are distributed. If an entity is violating or discriminating against someone based on those particular characteristics that I mentioned before, if they discriminate against them, then they could have funding removed from them. And that's just a small piece of what the Civil Rights Act did. Now, the issue with the Equality Act that's stirring up a lot of people right now is the fact that the Equality Act is hopes to basically redefine one of the words that was in the original Civil Rights Act, and that word is the word sex. Now, originally in the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the word sex was in reference to male or female. A person or an individual could not be discriminated against based on the fact that they were male or female. Today, the Equality Act, which has been around since the early 1990s, has been basically just an idea. But to just give you a quick example of how the Equality Act has grown in popularity, is originally it was basically unable to gain any ground at the federal level. Presently, there are 20 states that currently have laws in place similar to the Equality Act, which added these particular entities, gender identity and sexual orientation to the protected classes. Outside of that, we're looking at 30 states presently that do not have it. The Equality Act hopes to redefine, to amend the Civil Rights Act by adding these two, but they also want to redefine the word sex as it was originally placed and intended in the civil rights law. And if the individuals and the groups and organizations that are pushing for the Equality Act manage to do this, then the word sex would not only mean male or female, it would also make reference to sexual orientation and gender identity. The major proponents for the Equality Act, of course, are the LGBTQ community, and they're the ones that are pushing the most for this. And of course, we have a lot of states and a lot of people who are also supporting them that are outside of that community as well. Now, the reason this is interesting is this basically had no ground whatsoever for many years, but now here it is, 2019, and the Equality Act is still around. And in fact, it actually recently passed in the House of Representatives by overwhelming majority of Democratic support. The fact that, that the next step would be for it to go to the Senate is indicative of how much strength this thing has gained in the past 26, 27 years. So it was at one time something that could have never even gotten to the floor of the House or the Senate, and it now has passed in the House. So the only thing left for it to do would be to pass in the Senate. Now, be upfront with you and honest about it. The likelihood of that happening is slim to none. In all likelihood, Senator Mitch McConnell would probably leave it in a committee and it would never even get to the floor of the Senate for a vote. But if it did get to a vote, then in all likelihood, President Trump would veto it and there wouldn't be enough support to override the veto. So, to be upfront before we start talking about this, the likelihood of this thing passing now is slim to none. But that doesn't mean that, if changes in the House and Senate take place or a majority takes place in both houses that agree with the Equality Act, then this could very well someday become a law. Now, another reason that this is interesting to discuss is because there's a very good possibility that even though it is gaining mild traction in at the federal level, it's gaining traction at the state level almost on a weekly basis. And as I told you before, 20 states currently embrace it. 30 states don't have any laws on the books for it right now. Well, let's take a look at it first of all. As I said before, the Equality Act, in my personal opinion, is anything but the Equality Act. In fact, it can be, in a lot of ways, very detrimental to a lot of people. First of all, one of the things that the Equality Act would do is it would penalize anyone that disagreed with sexual orientation or gender identity doctrine. A penalty actually could be implemented against someone who disagreed with it. Now, we think of America and you've got freedom, to have your own opinions. Well, sure, you can have your opinion, but if you happen to be working for maybe the government or a government office or a government entity of some type, and you share an opinion that is contradictory to this sexual orientation or gender identity doctrine that's being promoted, then you potentially could lose your job, or you could undergo some type of corrective training to get your mind right, I guess you could say. So this is something that is very real, especially if you are working for federal, state, and even local government. And it doesn't end there. You'll find that out in just a minute. Employers and workers would be forced by law to compromise their views and accept these new things as sexual norms. And that is, for the most part, what this is about. The Equality Act really doesn't have a whole lot to do with about treating people equal, but it does have a tremendous amount of literature or persuasive writing in it that would basically force individuals to compromise their views and accept these things as new social norms. And I want you to think about Jack Phillips, the Colorado cake baker, as an example. This is a gentleman who did not work for the federal, state, or local government. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And why did he have to go to court? Well, because he refused to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. And what's really interesting about this is that an individual could literally lose their business or their job simply for disagreeing with transgenderism or sexual orientation doctrine. The idea that we have in America, the idea that you can be what you want to be, think how you want to think, have your own opinions, and have free speech, doesn't necessarily cut it when it comes to this particular Equality Act. People are basically forced into accepting or performing certain tasks. In the case here, Mr. Phillips was nearly saw his entire bakery go under, and fortunately for him, he was able to win the case. but unfortunately for him, it cost him a tremendous amount of money in doing so. Now, we can look at that particular case and talk about the fact that the creativity, that what he does is considered a craft and art. We can go down that road if we want to, but instead of talking about that on the program, one thing I would like to maybe focus a little bit more on is the fact that the Equality Act has one goal and one goal only, and that is to normalize certain types of behavior. And it might be behavior that you do not agree with. And the best way of taking care of individuals who do not agree with these types of behaviors would be to silence them. And that is essentially what the Equality Act would do, is it would silence you. And when there is no dissenting opinion or discourse in a society, then what you're going to have is you're going to have one prevalent, one dominant narrative, and that narrative is going to be allowed to prosper and grow and flourish. And that is the entire purpose behind the Equality Act. It is to silence anyone who might disagree with same-sex marriage, transgenderism, gender fluidity, all of this stuff that we're hearing today and you're listening to on TV and on social media. Another group that could be heavily impacted would be medical professionals. They would basically be forced to go against their own moral convictions, provide certain treatments or deny certain therapies, even if they deem these therapies necessary. Medical professionals could be forced to make decisions not based on medical expertise, but instead they would be making their decisions based on ideological fiat. And this is happening. We are seeing medical professionals who are going on the record and making statements that gender dysphoria and things of that nature are conditions that are not normal. And when they do that, they are being ostracized by peers within their own community. And in many cases, they're having their entire business operations and their career ruined for simply stating a fact. So medical professionals, in many cases, would have to perform surgeries or perform certain types of treatments, I should say, that maybe they did not want to. And if they refused to do it, then they would be labeled, of course, as a homophobe or a bigot or something of that nature. And then they would, of course, as a result of that, probably be ostracized and lose their business or their practice. Parents and children would be severely impacted by the Equality Act. Parents basically would no longer have the right to choose what is best for their children. And this is happening right now. There's an incident that took place in Ohio recently where parents lost custody of their daughter because they refused to put her on testosterone treatments. And she was 17 years of age. Parents refused to do it. The state came in and took the child from the parents because, as far as they're concerned, the parents cannot make a decision for the child at that age. And what's interesting is this goes even beyond that. Some of you may have heard a little bit about the story of the young boy, I think he was 10 years old, who was actually dressing in drag and was performing and dancing in front of men at a drag club somewhere. And anyone that objected to this, well, they were the ones who had the problem apparently, and not the child or the parents who were permitting this to happen. This is some pretty serious stuff here, and for the most part, basically what the Equality Act, and on the surface, the Equality Act appears to be attempting to help people, to assure that people are not being discriminated against, which is a good thing. But the problem with that is how and to what extent it is being used. I want you to think about this just for a second. There's a certain stereotype that goes with people today who are, for example, white supremacists, people who are members of the KKK, organizations that are basically white nationalists and things of that nature. there is a stigma that goes with them. Nobody wants to be associated with that. No one wants to be called a racist. The same stigma that is attached to those people who have those rotten ideologies, that same stigma would be attached to an individual who disagreed with this particular lifestyle. And you and I both know that these two things are not the same. As I mentioned before, parents and children would be affected greatly. Women in general, the Equality Act would basically erase the identification of what it means to be a woman. And some people say, well, how is that even possible? Well, it's basically going to remove sex-specific facilities, eventually establishments that have male and female, or men and women, or boys and girls restrooms. Those facilities would start coming under considerable condemnation for having those restrooms, and basically you would see sex-specific facilities would eventually start to be removed, especially in federal, state, and local government buildings. If you were an organization, for example, we'll get there in a second. I guess I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Bathrooms, locker rooms. You would also see the beginning of the end. In my opinion, it's already started for female athletics. The Equality Act basically would pretty much dismantle anything associated with Title IX, whose primary purpose was to make sure that women had the same opportunities in athletics and in the public sphere as men did. It would allow men who say that they are women participate in women's sports. This is already happening. We're seeing men win state track meets recently. First, second, and third in the state. We're seeing men break women's bodybuilding records. And they're doing all of this saying that they identify as a female, and they are being granted permission to participate. And the number one reason they're being granted permission to participate is the fear that they will cry discrimination. And this is the problem. As I said before, nobody wants to be called a racist, and nobody wants to be called a homophobe or whatever, or a transphobe. And in doing these things, this is what comes with it. And so many people in society just don't want to have to put up with a backlash, especially businesses and organizations. There's a lot of collateral that comes with this. In addition to the women in general, parents and children, medical professionals, one of the big ones is the church and faith-based organizations will be dramatically impacted. Similar state-based laws have already shut down several faith-based organizations. If, for example, faith-based organization that was an adoption agency was recently shut down because they did not include same-sex couples in the adoption program, and because they were a nonprofit organization which operates through the federal government. The federal government declared, or not the federal in this case, but state government declared that they were discriminating against same-sex couples or LGBTQ couples, and as a result of that, their nonprofit status was revoked and the agency was shut down. If you believe that children are best raised at home by a father and a mother, and you are in any way associated with the government, then your organization or agency could be shut down. You could have an agency or an organization that simply, for example, there was one in Alaska that actually provided food, shelter, and counseling for homeless, abused, and trafficked women. This particular organization was recently sued by a biological man, and his argument was he identified as a woman and he should be allowed to enter the facility and receive the facility's benefits. He argued that he was being discriminated against, and bang, the organization lost its 501c3 status with the federal government. And this is prior to this happening. So there's a multitude of reasons why this could be a problem. And we're going to talk about just a few more of them here in just a second. And then after that, we'll come right back and finish out with the program. All right, welcome back to the show. As we said a minute ago, we were talking about the Equality Act, and there's a multitude of ways that it can impact or affect possibly you or someone in your organization or even your church eventually. If you, and I want to go back to the Jack Phillips case, that is the bakery. It went all the way to the Supreme Court after basically the Colorado Civil Rights Commission accused him of discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation. In other words, you're not allowed to have an opinion about sexual orientation. If you disagree with it, then you are discriminating, period. That's the way they were looking at it. Well, fortunately for him, the Supreme Court ruled in his favor, and but it left a question that needed to be answered. And the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act is still left in limbo because of the Supreme Court decision. Basically, the day after, I want you to listen to this, the day after the Supreme Court rendered its decision, found him not guilty of discrimination, an attorney by the name of Autumn Scardina, who happens to identify as transgender, requested that he create a gender transition cake. Now, I want you to keep in mind, this is the day after the Supreme Court renders its decision. This transgender attorney comes in and asks that he create a gender transition cake. He declined to do so. The Civil Rights Commission found probable cause under the law that he had discriminated, and bang, we're back at it again. Eventually, the commission dropped the case for Phillips. But look at the things that he lost. He lost a tremendous amount of income. His business was nearly destroyed, all because he believed that marriage is between a man and a woman. And this is not exclusive just to Phillips. We've seen this happen with florists, photographers, wedding venue owners, videographers, web designers. Even calligraphers have been sued. Public servants, anyone. So this is just the beginning of this, and it's all because it's all an attempt to silence any disagreement over gender identity or sexual orientation. There is a reality that comes with the biology of sex, and for the most part, this entire movement is denying all reality. This thing would severely compel speech. I want to give you an example of something that happened here in the state of Virginia. A Virginia high school teacher by the name of Peter Vlaming literally lost his job. He was a veteran teacher, and he was fired basically over the objections of his students after he refused to comply with administrators. The administrators' orders basically told him to use masculine pronouns in referring to a female student who identifies as transgender. He refused to use masculine pronouns. We're talking about people losing their job because they do not use the proper pronoun that someone else wants them to use. This is a very, very sad reality of the society and culture that we live in today. In this particular case, the teacher did everything he could to accommodate the student. He tried not to violate his own religious belief that God created human beings, male and female. The Bible says that God created male and female, created he them. He even used the student's new name that the student asked to be used by. This man clearly made the attempt to do the best within his ability to accommodate the student, but because he did not refer to the proper pronoun, the student claimed that they were being discriminated against. You can play this and flip it the other way if you want to. You know, if how many times have you sued someone because they didn't refer to you by the proper pronoun? I think you realize what this is about. It's not about pronouns. It's not about anything else. It's about forcing a particular ideology, forcing a particular sexual preference, and forcing people to accept these things as social norms. This is what it's about. As I mentioned before, foster care, a lot of charities would be impacted by this, of course. And I told you that you're going to see males participate in girls' sports. It's already happening. It's going to get worse. Affects medical professionals, and eventually it's going to affect parents with their children. And then, of course, as I said before, it will affect or have a big impact on churches and nonprofit and charitable organizations all across this country. So if you haven't heard about the Equality Act, that's just a little bit about it. Some things that we felt like that maybe we needed to cover and get out there and talk a little bit about it. There's a lot of information on it online. You can look it up. Most of what you hear on the mainstream media is going to be nothing but positive. But like I said, the road to hell, as they say, is paved with good intention. There may be a lot of good intention behind it, but when you look at it on the surface, it's not very good when you start digging a little bit. All right, coming up in just a second, we're going to go to our History Matters segment, and we'll be right back. All right, well, as we say each week, history matters. There's a lot of important history out there, a lot of history that we do not know. And this week we've got a little bit of little nugget here for you. Did you realize that there was actually a Christmas prayer that took place in lunar orbit in 1968 by 3 astronauts? The astronauts of Apollo 8, which was the first manned mission to the moon, entered orbit around the moon on Christmas Eve in 1968. And while they were circling the moon, the 3 astronauts hosted a live telecast. And all 3 of those astronauts read from Genesis 1 in the Bible. And I think it was Frank Borman actually is the one who delivered the Christmas greeting. And it's a really neat thing to know that our astronauts were up there in space. I mean, amazing how times have changed. We got some news coming up here in just a second that's going to be pretty interesting, but times really have changed. The 3 astronauts read from Genesis 1, and then they offered up this prayer. I'm going to read this prayer to you. This is by Frank Borman, and this is what he said on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1968, as they were orbiting the moon. Give us, O God, the vision which can see thy love in the world in spite of human failure. Give us the faith, the trust, the goodness in spite of our ignorance and weakness. Give us the knowledge that we may continue to pray with understanding hearts, and show us what each one of us can do to set forth the coming of the day of universal peace. Amen. And that's the prayer that was issued by Frank Borman. He was on board, I think, with William Anders and James Lavelle on December 24th, 1968, as they were orbiting the moon, and it was transmitted back to Earth for everyone on Earth to listen to. Just another little nugget from history that you probably won't hear or probably didn't even know about. All right, in the news this week, give you a couple little headlines here. So Help Me God has been removed from all House of Representatives committee oaths that will take place. And that recently took place. It actually was on the recommended earlier on, but it didn't really become a talking point until recently when an individual was being sworn in and they were taking the oath. And basically what happened, the words, "So help me God," were removed from the oath. The individual was preparing to testify before a congressional committee, and as they were doing so, they were saying the oath, and this is something that it has been around for a very long time. As George Washington, when he originally took the oath, he added that part to it when he said, "So help me God." And at first it appeared to be a simple mistake, but then upon finding out a little bit more about it, it wasn't. Representative Steve Cohen, a Democrat from Texas, who's the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, the subcommittee, he specifically omitted "So help me God" when swearing in a witness at a hearing, and Representative Mike Johnson actually tried to correct the oath and asked him, was it an accident, or would you please have them repeat, and "So help me," say "So help me God," to which Representative Steve Cohen basically said no, and he said, "I think God belongs in religious institutions." So it is an official. This isn't just rumor. It is official. The phrase "So help me God" has been removed from House committee oaths, and of course, without getting into a lot of details, we know exactly which party controls the House right now. So that ought to tell you a little bit about perhaps the direction that party is moving in, or at least the people who are pulling the levers, the direction that they're moving in, and it's not a good thing for our country. And really sad news: a 3-year-old son of country music singer Granger Smith drowned. His son's name was River Kelly Smith, and tragic victim of a drowning accident. The family donated the child's organs and hoped that they could save other lives. And in a statement, the family said that he is with his heavenly Father. So keep that family in your prayers. Just tragic to lose a 3-year-old son at that age. But to agree, as with David in the Bible said, David his son couldn't come back to him, but he could go to where he was. And, the Bible says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And we believe that that's where little River Kelly Smith is at right now. In other news, the Trump administration recently reversed an Obama-era move and banned the use of LGBTQ rainbow flags from flying from the flagstaff of all U.S. embassies. Now, contrary to what some of the stuff you may be hearing on social media, the flags are not banned in the embassies. They are only banned from flying from the flagstaff. And I have to say I agree with this, because that flagstaff is there to fly one flag and one flag only, and that's the American flag. And this is something that was started prior to the same-sex marriage being ruled illegal under the Obama administration. And so this is actually a reversal of an Obama-era decision by the Trump administration. Another interesting story, the University of Alabama recently returned a $21.5 million donation from a donor who wanted basically the university to boycott the recent Alabama decision to ban abortion. The gentleman, Hugh Culverhouse Jr., was one of the university's largest donors. The university returned the money, and as of today, his name has been removed from the Alabama School of Law's outdoor sign. So all these stories do impact or affect us to some nature and whatever, and this is what's going on in your world. Coming up next, we got Parting Shots. Okay, it's time for Parting Shots. Before we leave today, we'd like to thank everyone for listening to the show. Ask that you continue to tune in. We try to crank these things out every Tuesday. We will start submitting some briefs, we will call them, and these will be short 5 and 6 minute commentaries on certain things happening in our culture. But in Parting Shots, the Cartoon Network recently used the Powerpuff Girls to promote the LGBTQ Pride Month. Cartoon Network's basically pandering to kids and encouraging them to stand proud during Pride Month. The View co-host, Sunny Hostin, recently suggested that children were safer at an LGBTQ Pride event than they would be in church. She even suggested that Jesus would attend a LGBTQ Pride parade with pride. Folks, this stuff is real. This stuff is a very real set of circumstances, and our children are being inundated from every direction. I likened it the other day to blowing up a balloon and then taking pencils and gently pushing them all over the balloon and from many different directions. And our children are being hit right and left, right, left, top down, inside out, bottom up. They're being hit everywhere with this, as well as everyone else in our society. The attempt to normalize certain types of behavior that God says is an abomination is a real issue that needs to be dealt with. But at the same time, we need to pray for those that are suffering, those that might be confused, and we also need to try not to put ourselves in a position of judgment, but rather look at what the Word of God says and stand firm on that, and then try to let God be the one that does the judging, and let us be the one that perhaps does the admonishment, or the one that does that stands firm on what is true and what is not. It's a very, very serious time that we're living in. Recommend a book for you. It's called War Against the Weak. It's written by a gentleman by the name of Edwin Black. It's a really good book. It's a big book, and it discusses the history of the eugenics movement in America. Highly recommend this book. It is incredibly eye-opening, and it will help lay the foundation so that you might better understand more about the abortion movement and how Planned Parenthood and the eugenics movement got started, what was the ideology behind it. It's just a really, really good book. I recommend it once again. That's War Against the Weak. All right, well, that's all the time we have for this week. We really do appreciate everyone for tuning in. Share this podcast with some of your friends. We'd like to get the numbers up just a little bit, get the word out. We'll continue doing this as often as we possibly can. And as I said before, look forward to doing some of those briefs. Download it. Check us out at Grace Plus Zero. You can download us at Spreaker, iTunes. We're available in just about anywhere you get a podcast. You can get it. And once again, we thank you. And as we always say, from the rising of the sun to the going down of the same, the name of the Lord shall be praised.